By the end of the Second World War, one armoured vehicle had been built more times than any other in history, more than the Sherman, more than the Tiger. And the man whose idea made it possible never lived to see a single one fight. He died on a December evening in 1935. On a December evening in 1935, a Belgian airliner was flying toward Croydon, just south of London, through weather that had been closing in all day. Wind and rain battered the aircraft, and ice may have been gathering on its wings. As it came in on its approach, it flew into the high ground at Tatsfield, in Surrey. When it struck the hillside, every one of the 11 people aboard was killed. Among the dead was a man most people had never heard of. His name was John Valentine Carden. He was 43 years old. He was an engineer. He did not command armies. He did not write the strategies that would soon decide the fate of nations. He built machines. Small ones, practical ones, the kind of machines that no one writes songs about. And yet the idea he had spent his short life refining was about to go to war on a scale he could never have imagined. Within 5 years, the concept he helped set in motion would roll onto battlefields on 3 continents. Within a decade, it would become the most produced armoured fighting vehicle in the history of the world. More than the Sherman, more than the Tiger, more than any tank ever built by any nation. Carden would not live to see a single one of them fight. The man behind the machine died years before the machine had even earned its name. This is the story of that machine. And to understand why it mattered, you first have to understand the problem it was born to solve. In the years between the 2 world wars, every modern army wrestled with the same uncomfortable truth. The foot soldier was the most flexible weapon they had. He could climb, he could crawl, he could wade through rivers and squeeze through gaps no vehicle could ever follow. He could go almost anywhere, but he was slow, he was exposed, and he grew tired. The machine gun had changed everything. Open ground that infantry once crossed at a walk had become a killing field. A single well-placed gun could pin down an entire company. Heavy weapons that the infantry desperately needed up front, the mortars, the ammunition, the supporting fire, had to be hauled forward by exhausted men, often under fire, often too late. The British Army watched smaller conflicts unfold through the 1930s, in Spain, in East Africa, and drew a hard conclusion. The infantry needed help. They needed something that could carry weight forward across dangerous ground, something that could keep a soldier alive long enough to reach the fight. A tank could do part of the job. But a tank was expensive, a tank was complex, a tank demanded skilled crews, specialized factories, and rare materials. To build enough tanks to follow every infantry section into battle was simply impossible. It would have bankrupted the army before the war even began. What they needed was something else, something smaller, something cheaper, something an ordinary soldier could learn to drive in a week. Something a country could build not in the hundreds, but in the tens of thousands. It was a problem John Carden had spent years trying to answer, long before those conflicts ever played out. Through the 1920s and into the 1930s, Carden had worked for Vickers, one of Britain's great arms manufacturers. He specialized in light-tracked vehicles, the small and unglamorous cousins of the tank. Alongside his partner Vivian Lloyd, he developed a series of compact machines that crawled across rough ground on tracks but cost a fraction of what a true tank demanded. They were tiny. They were strange-looking. Critics dismissed them as toys even then. But Carden was not chasing prestige. He was chasing a principle. His reasoning was almost ruthless in its clarity. You did not need armor thick enough to stop an artillery shell, he argued, because a vehicle like this would never trade blows with a tank. You needed only enough armor to stop a rifle bullet, enough to turn aside shell splinters, enough to keep a crew alive while they crossed the open ground where unprotected men died. Everything else Carden was willing to sacrifice, and this is where the design becomes fascinating, because nearly every feature that outsiders would later mock was in fact a deliberate choice. The vehicle would be low, barely 1.5 meters tall. To a soldier standing beside it, it looked almost insultingly small. But that low profile meant that when it crossed open ground, it gave the enemy almost nothing to aim at. The armor would be thin. Between 7 and 10 millimeters of steel at its thickest. A German tank of the era carried 3 times that. But thicker armor meant more weight, and more weight meant a heavier engine, a higher cost, and a slower machine. Carden's philosophy traded protection for speed, and speed on the open battlefield was a kind of protection all its own, and the top would be open, completely open to the sky. To an untrained eye, this looked like madness. An open-topped vehicle offered no protection from above, from grenades, from shrapnel falling out of the air. Engineers who later saw the layout sometimes assumed it was a mistake. It was not a mistake. The open top saved weight, which fed directly back into speed and fuel economy. And it gave the crew something no enclosed machine could offer, a clear, unobstructed view of the world around them. In the chaos of battle, the ability to see in every direction could matter more than a roof of steel. Even the engine reflected the same cold logic. Rather than design a custom military power plant, the engineers chose a Ford V8, a commercial automobile engine, around 85 horsepower, the kind already mass-produced by the millions for civilian cars and trucks. It could push the vehicle to roughly 30 miles an hour on a decent road, modest by the standards of a sports car. But to infantry, who moved at a walking pace of 3 miles an hour, it was transformative. Every one of these decisions pointed in the same direction: cheap, simple, fast. Buildable in enormous numbers by ordinary factories using ordinary parts. This was not a weapon designed to terrify the enemy. It was a weapon designed to be everywhere, all the time, in numbers no opponent could match. By the late 1930s, the British Army faced a different kind of headache. Carden's ideas had spawned not one vehicle but several. There was a carrier built around the Bren light machine gun, there was a scout carrier, there was a cavalry carrier. Each was tuned for a slightly different task, and each demanded its own spare parts, its own training, its own logistics. The variety was becoming a burden. So, as the 1930s drew toward their close, the War Office made a decision that would prove far more important than anyone realized at the time. They ordered the development of a single machine that could absorb all those roles at once. One hull, one engine, one set of spare parts. A vehicle that could be configured for almost any job the army could imagine. They gave it a name that was almost laughably plain. They called it the Universal Carrier. The name fit. Strip out the seats and load it with ammunition crates, and it became a supply vehicle. Mount a stretcher frame across the hull, and it became a battlefield ambulance that could reach wounded men where no truck dared go. Bolt on a radio set, and it carried communications forward into positions that would have swallowed a wheeled vehicle whole. Swap the Bren gun for an anti-tank rifle, a mortar, or a close-range launcher, and it changed its character entirely. One frame, a dozen faces. It rode on a horseman-type suspension, with coil-sprung bogies mounted on the outside of the hull. The arrangement gave the little machine a surprisingly smooth ride across broken ground and let its tracks grip terrain that would have stopped a heavier vehicle. Drivers who trained on it described it as almost intuitive, easy to learn. Forgiving in a way the heavier tanks never were, everything was falling into place. The concept that John Carden had spent his career sharpening was finally taking its final form, ready to be built in the numbers he had always believed were possible. But Carden was not there to see it. He had died in that aircraft in the winter of 1935, years before the Universal Carrier was even given its name. He never saw the design that grew out of his life's work. He never watched it cross a desert or a jungle or a beach. He never learned that the machines descended from his ideas would one day outnumber every tank on Earth. His colleagues at Vickers and within the War Office carried the work forward. The hull, the open top, the civilian engine, the obsession with simplicity and numbers, these were the bones of his philosophy, and they survived him. But the man himself was gone before the story even truly began. He would become a footnote while the machine became a legend. And as the world slid toward another war, no one yet understood what that small, plain, open-topped vehicle was about to become. In the spring of 1940, the German army would smash into France, and somewhere in the wreckage of that retreat, a German tank crewman would climb down from his armored monster, walk over to an abandoned British carrier sitting silent in the mud, and kick its thin side plate with the toe of his boot. He would look at this tiny, open-topped little thing, this machine that seemed barely armored at all, and he would dismiss it with a single word: a toy. He was wrong. And the proof of just how wrong he was had only begun. In the spring of 1940, the German army did something no one had thought possible. They broke through. The blow fell through the Ardennes, the forested hills that French generals had judged too thick, too rugged for tanks. They were wrong. German armour poured through the gap and raced for the sea, and in a matter of days they had sliced the British Expeditionary Force away from its supply lines, away from its allies, away from any path of retreat that did not end at the edge of the English Channel. What followed was not a battle. It was a desperate fighting withdrawal toward a single port town on the French coast, Dunkirk. The dramatic story of Dunkirk is the story everyone knows. The beaches, the little ships, the hundreds of thousands of men plucked from the sand by an armada of fishing boats and pleasure craft and naval vessels. It is one of the great escapes in military history. But there is another story underneath that one, a quieter story, and it belongs to a small open-topped machine that almost no one remembers. As British infantry fell back through the towns of Belgium and northern France, the Universal Carrier was there in the middle of the chaos. Loaded with ammunition, it pushed forward against the tide of retreat to reach the rear guards, the men holding the line so the rest of the army could escape. It brought them the bullets and the mortar bombs that kept them fighting. Then it turned around and carried the wounded back, reaching men who lay in places no truck could ever go. It carried radios, it carried orders. In a retreat where communication was breaking down by the hour, where units were losing contact with one another in the smoke and confusion, the little carrier became a thread of coordination running through the disaster. And at towns like Kassel, on the shrinking perimeter around Dunkirk itself, carriers fought. Their single machine guns hammered away at advancing German infantry, while exhausted British soldiers pulled back, step by step, toward the beaches and the boats and the slim hope of home. But there was no room on those boats for vehicles. The men came first, the men were everything, and so, in the final hours, British soldiers did something that must have been hard to watch. They took the carriers that had carried them, the machines that had hauled their wounded and their ammunition through the worst days of their lives, and they wrecked them. They smashed the engines. They fired bullets into the radiators. Some they simply drove straight into the sea, watching the grey water close over the hulls so that the enemy could never use them. Hundreds of them were left behind on that coast, abandoned in the sand, sunk in the shallows, silent in the mud of 100 French roadsides. The German army came forward and found them there, and here is where the story turns in a way no one expected. The same army whose soldiers had kicked these little machines and called them toys now looked at them with very different eyes. German engineers were practical men. They examined the abandoned carriers with the cold professional curiosity of mechanics, and they reached the very conclusion their own commanders had missed. This little machine was simple. It was reliable. It could be repaired with ordinary tools by ordinary men. It asked for nothing exotic. It just worked. So the conquerors put the conquered machine to work. German units, especially on the brutal Eastern Front against the Soviet Union, began using captured British carriers as their own. They hauled ammunition with them. They moved supplies with them. And in more than a few cases, German engineers went further, bolting on small artillery pieces and anti-tank guns, turning the captured carriers into improvised fighting vehicles their British designers had never dreamed of. There are photographs that survive from those years. Universal carriers, unmistakable in their shape, rolling across the Russian steppe under German markings. The German army even gave the machine an official place in their inventory, a designation that has come down to us as 731A, the letter marking it as English in origin. They used those captured carriers until the engines wore out and the spare parts ran dry, which in some cases meant fighting on into 1943 and beyond. Think about that. A machine the German army had dismissed as a worthless toy in 1940 was still serving in German hands 3 years later, prized enough that they kept it running until there was nothing left to repair it with. The mockery had become respect. The toy had become an asset, even to the enemy, but the real revolution was happening far from any battlefield. It was happening in the factories. back in Britain and across the wider Commonwealth, the production of universal carriers was beginning to climb toward numbers the pre-war planners had never imagined. And the reason traced directly back to the design choices that had once seemed so strange. Remember the engine, that ordinary Ford V8. It had been chosen not for its power, but for what it represented. It was an American design, built in enormous numbers for civilian cars and trucks, and the world was already full of the parts and the tools and the trained hands to keep it running. This was the quiet genius of the whole machine. A Ford dealership in Canada, in Australia, in New Zealand, anywhere the company did business, was effectively a depot of spare parts and mechanical knowledge for the carrier. The man who had fixed family sedans before the war could, with little extra training, keep a military vehicle alive in the field. The carrier did not demand a new generation of specialist mechanics. It used the ones the modern world had already created, and the same logic transformed how the machine was built. A tank was a creature of the specialist factory. Every Tiger that Germany produced required components machined to extraordinary tolerances, fitted together by hand by skilled craftsmen, drawing on rare steel and scarce expertise. Tanks could only be born in a handful of places, and those places became bottlenecks and targets. The universal carrier was different by design. Its hull was made of flat steel plates that could be cut and welded by an apprentice following a template. Its engine came off a civilian production line. It needed no exotic metals, no master machinists, no precision beyond what an ordinary automobile factory already possessed. This meant the carrier could be built almost anywhere, and so it was. In Britain, factories turned them out around the clock, but Britain alone could not meet the demand, because every theatre of the war was now crying out for more of them. So production spread across the Commonwealth like water finding its level. Canada became a powerhouse. Canadian factories, drawing on the same Ford engines and the same North American industrial base, produced carriers by the tens of thousands, mechanically identical to the British originals. Australia built them. New Zealand contributed as well. Each nation produced the same fundamental machine, with only small local differences, all of them sharing the same beating Ford heart. And this created something the planners had stumbled into almost by accident. Resilience. The German Air Force could bomb a British tank factory and choke off a critical supply. But you could not bomb the whole Commonwealth. If the factories in Britain had been smashed flat, the carriers would have kept rolling off the lines in Ontario, in Sydney, in cities an ocean away from any German bomber. The production of this little machine had been scattered so widely that no enemy could ever shut it down. A weakness, the planners had been told, an open-topped, thin-skinned little toy. In truth, they had built one of the most unstoppable production systems of the entire war, and they had done it by refusing to make the machine impressive. Out in the field, the carrier kept finding new ways to prove itself, and nowhere did it adapt more dramatically than in the deserts of North Africa. The Western Desert was a punishing place for machines, heat, dust that ground its way into every moving part, vast empty distances where a breakdown could mean death. But the desert also suited the carrier's particular gifts. The ground was often firm enough for the tracks to grip without bogging. The open terrain rewarded a vehicle with a low silhouette, and against the shimmering haze of the desert, the little carrier was hard to even see at long range. Carriers ranged far ahead of the main forces on reconnaissance, scouting enemy positions, probing for weakness, reporting back what lay over the next ridge. Sometimes they pushed deeper into enemy territory than was wise, and sometimes it was a carrier that raced back in to pull out a scout team before the trap closed. They became instruments of the night as well. A handful of carriers could move fast across the dark desert, navigating by compass and by the shape of the land, slipping to within a few hundred yards of an enemy camp. Then the infantry would leap off, strike hard and fast, and be gone again before the enemy could organize any answer. The whole tactic lived or died on the speed of the withdrawal, and the carrier delivered that speed where slower wheeled vehicles would have bogged in the soft sand and been lost. But it was on the other side of the world that the machine performed perhaps its most surprising feat of all. In Burma, the war was fought in a green hell of jungle and mountain and monsoon. The trails were narrow, the vegetation was dense enough to swallow an army. And when the rains came, the unpaved ground turned to a sucking mud that pulled wheeled vehicles down to their axles and held them there. The Japanese understood this terrain. They built their defensive plans around it. Certain approaches, they judged, were simply impossible for any mechanized vehicle. No truck could come that way. No supply column could follow. They were safe behind the wall of the jungle itself. The universal carrier proved them wrong. Its weight was spread across long tracks that pressed gently on the ground, and that lightness of print let it crawl through mud and along jungle paths that stopped heavier machines cold. British and Indian troops used carriers to push supplies forward along tracks the Japanese had written off as unusable. Routes that were supposed to be safe suddenly were not. Positions that were supposed to be unreachable suddenly had British forces appearing where no vehicle was ever meant to go. It was not a glamorous achievement. There were no headlines about a supply carrier crawling through the mud of the Arakan, but it rewrote the map of what was possible, and it handed British commanders an edge their enemy had never accounted for. The machine that the Germans had mocked as a toy was, in the jungles of Burma, quietly making a fortified enemy's careful plans irrelevant, and then came Normandy. On the 6th of June, 1944, the Allies returned to France. The Universal Carrier was there from the first hours, coming ashore with the assault infantry, hauling the heavy weapons and the ammunition and the radios across beaches swept by fire and broken by obstacles. By then it was no longer the new idea of a peacetime army. It was a veteran of 3 continents, 6 years into a war it had never been expected to fight. But the worst was still ahead, because beyond the beaches lay the Bocage. The Norman countryside was an ancient patchwork of small fields, and each field was walled in by thick earthen banks crowned with dense, tangled hedgerows that had grown for centuries. Between them ran sunken lanes, dark and narrow, hemmed in on both sides. It was beautiful country, and it was a nightmare to fight in. For the great Allied tanks, the Bocage was a trap. A tank in open country was a king, but here, hemmed in by walls of earth and hedge, it was blind and clumsy. It could not see. It could not turn. German anti-tank teams hid in the shadow of the next hedgerow and waited, and a tank that nosed through a gap often did not survive the moment. The very vehicles that were supposed to lead the breakout were dying in the lanes, and in that landscape the small, low, unloved carrier found itself perfectly at home. It was little enough to slip down the sunken lanes, low enough to keep from the enemy's eye. It moved through the hedgerow country with an ease the heavy armour could only envy. The machine that gave up so much protection for the sake of size and speed had stumbled into the one battlefield where size and speed were worth more than armour. But it was one particular version of the carrier that became something close to a terror in the Bocage: the Wasp. The Wasp was a universal carrier with its ordinary weapons stripped away and a flamethrower fitted in their place. It could throw a stream of burning fuel out to a range of roughly 100 yards. It had been built for one purpose: to attack the kind of dug-in strongpoints that cost attacking infantry such terrible numbers of lives. In the Bocage, a single German machine gun nest tucked into the corner of a hedgerow could hold up an entire company for hours. Bullets could not reach the gunners behind their bank of earth. Frontal assault meant feeding men into the gun one after another. The Wasp ended those standoffs in seconds. Flame did not need a clear line of sight the way a bullet did. It poured around corners. It flowed through firing slits and gaps in the earth. It found the spaces that no rifle round could reach, and it did something to a defender that no ordinary weapon could match. It broke the will to fight. After the war, German soldiers who had faced the Wasp tried to describe what it had been like. There was a particular horror to it, they said, that set it apart from shellfire and bullets. You could not duck behind cover and wait it out. You could not hide from it. There was the sound of the igniter, the rush of the burning fuel, and often only a single second of warning before a position that had held for hours became a place no human being could survive. German units that had stood firm against infantry attacks, that had beaten back conventional armour, sometimes abandoned their positions within minutes of a Wasp's arrival. British commanders learned this quickly, and they began to save the Wasp carriers for the hardest jobs of all, the strong points that were costing the most lives. It was a grim role for a machine that had been conceived as a simple infantry helper, but it was, by then, the truest expression of what the carrier had always been. Not a single weapon, but a frame onto which the army could bolt whatever the moment demanded. A taxi one day, an ambulance the next. A weapon of fire and terror in the hedgerows of France. By the summer of 1944, the universal carrier had served in the snows of the retreat from France, in the captured columns of the German army, in the deserts of Africa, in the jungles of Burma, and now in the bloody fields of Normandy. It had been built in Britain and Canada and Australia and beyond. It had carried bullets and bandages and radios and flame to every front where the war was fought. And still, almost no one outside the men who depended on it knew its name. The tanks got the glory, the generals got the headlines. The little open-top machine just kept moving forward, day after day, doing the unglamorous work that kept armies alive. But there was one more part of this story that even its own designers never fully grasped. A number, a single staggering number that would settle once and for all the question of whether this had ever truly been a toy. The question had hung over the universal carrier from the very first day, from the moment a German tank crewman kicked its side plate in the mud of France and called it a toy. Was this little machine ever really a serious weapon of war, or was it just a clever stopgap, a cheap substitute for the real thing? The answer is written in a single number. And it is a number that humbles the legends. Over the course of the war, more than 113,000 universal carriers were built. Stop and sit with that figure for a moment, because it is hard to grasp at first. 113,000. Built in Britain, in Canada, in Australia, in New Zealand, in workshops scattered across half the world. Now set it beside the machines we remember. The names that fill the documentaries and the museums and the imagination of every man who ever loved this history. The Tiger. The great German cat, the most feared tank of the war, the steel monster whose very name could empty a road. Germany built roughly 1,347 of them. The carrier outnumbered the Tiger by more than 80 to 1. The Sherman, the workhorse of the American army, one of the most produced tanks in all of history, the machine that carried the United States across Europe and the Pacific. Around 49,000 Shermans rolled off the lines, a staggering achievement of American industry and a tank that helped win the war. The universal carrier outproduced even the Sherman. By more than 2 to 1, this is the truth behind the title. The little open-top machine that everyone called a toy did in plain fact outproduce every tank ever built by any nation in the Second World War. Not by a slim margin, by a landslide. No single armoured fighting vehicle in the entire history of warfare has ever been built in greater numbers. None has come close since. And the reason traces all the way back to the choices that had once drawn ridicule. A Tiger had to be coaxed into existence by master craftsmen, fitting precision parts by hand, drawing on rare steel and rare skill in a handful of specialized plants. Each one was a small miracle of engineering, and that was exactly the problem. You cannot win a global war with miracles, you win it with numbers. The carrier asked for none of that. Its flat steel plates could be cut and welded by an apprentice following a pattern. Its engine came off an ordinary automobile line. It could be built in a factory that had spent peacetime stamping out car body panels by workers who had never touched a weapon of war in their lives. Every Tiger was a masterpiece. Every carrier was a template, and across 6 years of relentless production, that difference multiplied into a number no masterpiece could ever match. The men who designed it had not set out to break a record. They had set out to build something cheap and simple and buildable by ordinary hands. In doing exactly that, they created the most produced armoured vehicle the world has ever seen, or likely ever will. But the story does not end when the war does. Most weapons of the Second World War had their moment and then faded. They were melted down, mothballed, forgotten in scrapyards. The universal carrier refused to leave the stage. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the carriers were still everywhere, in numbers so vast that armies simply kept using them. They did not retire, they went looking for new wars. In 1948, when the fighting broke out that surrounded the founding of Israel, universal carriers fought on both sides of the conflict. Machines that had once worn British colours now served the new Israeli forces and the Arab armies alike, scattered across yet another battlefield by the simple fact that there were so many of them in the world. In the islands of Indonesia, as a nation fought its way to independence, carriers turned up again in the hands of colonial troops and the hands of the revolutionaries trying to drive them out. In Korea, when American and Commonwealth soldiers found themselves in a brutal new war on the other side of the world, the old carrier was still there in the early fighting, still doing the work it had always done. And in the British Army itself, the machine that had gone to war in 1940 stayed in service through the 1950s, soldiering on until it was finally retired around 1960. Think about the span of that. A vehicle born of an idea from the early 1930s was still serving in uniform a quarter of a century later. Boys, who had not yet been born when the first carriers crawled through the mud of Dunkirk, grew into men who drove them in the years after the war. The machine outlasted the conflict that created it, outlasted the empire that built it, and very nearly outlasted the men who had first dismissed it as a toy. And yet, for all of that, the universal carrier never became a legend. It never got the mythology. It never got the songs. No one stood in awe of it the way they stood in awe of a tiger rolling out of a tree line. No one told their grandchildren breathless stories of its firepower because it had so little. It did not terrify the enemy. It did not win battles in a single dramatic stroke. It was not beautiful, and it was not frightening, and it never tried to be. It just worked. It carried the bullets when the riflemen ran low. It carried the wounded out when there was no other way to reach them. It carried the radio that let a commander know his men were still alive. It crossed the desert and the jungle and the flooded fields where heavier, prouder machines bogged down and died. It was the connective tissue of the infantry war, the humble thread that ran through every campaign on every front, turning tired men on foot into a force that could move and fight and endure. The generals who planned the great offensives got the headlines, the tank commanders got the glory, but somewhere behind them, in the mud and the dust and the dark, a universal carrier was always moving forward. Carrying the supplies, carrying the wounded, carrying the war, and there is one last thing worth remembering, one name we should not let slip away. John Valentine Carden never saw any of it. The engineer who had set this whole idea in motion, who had argued that you did not need thick armour, only enough to stop a bullet, who had insisted that simplicity and numbers would matter more than power and prestige, had been dead since that cold December evening in 1935. He died at 43, years before the universal carrier was even given its name. He never watched it come ashore at Normandy. He never knew it crawled through the jungles of Burma. He never learned that the machines descended from his stubborn, unglamorous ideas would one day outnumber every tank on Earth. He had been right about everything, and he was not there to see it. That is a particular kind of legacy, the kind where a man plants a seed and dies before the tree ever breaks the soil. Where the full measure of a life's work only becomes clear long after the life itself is over. Carden became a footnote, a name that even serious students of the war often do not recognize. The machine became history, but perhaps that is fitting, because the carrier itself was a footnote too, the thing no one celebrated. The vehicle that did the quiet, essential, life-saving work while the spotlight fell on grander machines and louder men, and inside it, beating away under that thin steel hull, was that ordinary Ford engine. An American design at its heart, an engine of the kind that powered family cars by the million, now built across the factories of Britain and Canada, and driving the most produced armoured vehicle in the history of the world, on every battlefield of the greatest war ever fought. The toy that was not a toy, the genius who never saw his creation fight, the little machine that never stopped moving, 113,000 of them, more than every tank. More than any armoured vehicle ever built, before or since. They called it a toy. They could not have been more wrong.